Emily? Judge David Carter's voice trembled as he read the name on the docket for the defendant standing before him. The woman in the courtroom, her wrists bound by cuffs, looked up sharply. Their eyes locked. His breath hitched, and he felt the floor beneath him tilt. It wasn't just any Emily. It was her. Emily Monroe. The girl who had owned his heart all those years ago in high school. The one he'd written poems for, but never had the courage to share them with. The one who left town without a goodbye after graduation. David felt a surge of memories rushing back, but they were quickly overpowered by the reality in front of him. Emily stood accused of theft, and the charges were serious. The assistant district attorney had just finished outlining the case. If convicted, Emily could face years in prison. The courtroom fell silent as everyone waited for David to speak. But he couldn't. His lips felt like they were glued shut, and his gavel felt heavier than ever. How could he possibly judge the woman who had once been the center of his world? Just then, Emily's lips parted. "David," she whispered, her voice cracking. A mix of shock, recognition, and something else flickered in her eyes. Was it guilt, regret, or fear? Before David could say a word, the prosecutor spoke up. "Your Honor, shall we proceed?" David tightened his grip on the bench, his thoughts spinning wildly. How had she ended up here? What had brought her back into his life, and under such circumstances? As the courtroom buzzed with murmurs, David lifted his gavel, unsure of whether the next strike would change both their lives forever. It all started that Monday morning, a seemingly ordinary day in the bustling courthouse. David Carter had been a judge for 10 years, known for his calm demeanor and fair rulings. His colleagues admired him, and his courtroom was always orderly. On this particular day, his docket was filled with the usual cases, minor thefts, disputes, and misdemeanors. Nothing out of the ordinary. That was until he saw her name, Emily Monroe. The moment he read it, his heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be that Emily, could it? The girl who had once made his teenage heart race. The girl he had spent countless nights thinking about, but had never confessed his feelings to. Surely it was just a coincidence. Shaking off the thought, he reminded himself to stay professional. But as the bailiff called her name and the defendant was brought in, David's world tilted. It was her. Emily's once golden hair was now a shade darker, but her striking blue eyes were unmistakable. She wore an orange jumpsuit, her posture stiff as if bracing for impact. The confident, carefree girl he remembered from high school was gone. In her place stood a woman who looked weary, as though the weight of the world had crushed her spirit. David's mind reeled. What had happened to her after high school? The last he had heard, she had moved to Los Angeles to chase her dreams of becoming an artist. How did that vibrant, ambitious girl end up here, standing trial for theft? The case against Emily wasn't straightforward. According to the prosecutor, she had been caught on security footage stealing thousands of dollars worth of equipment from a local tech store. The evidence seemed damning, but something about it didn't sit right with David. This wasn't the Emily he knew. She wasn't a thief, but as a judge, he wasn't allowed to assume. The evidence would have to speak for itself. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the case unfolded. The prosecution presented grainy footage of a figure who could be Emily, shoving laptops into a bag. But the defense argued that the footage was unclear and that Emily had an alibi. She claimed she had been working at a diner across town at the time of the theft. David found himself gripping the edge of his seat, his emotions clouding his judgment. He needed answers, not just as a judge, but as the boy who had once loved her from afar. The trial took a recess, giving David time to compose himself. But his mind was a storm of questions. Should he recuse himself from the case? Was he capable of remaining impartial? And most importantly, what had happened to Emily in the years since they'd last seen each other? As he sat in his chambers, the memories came flooding back. He remembered the way she used to laugh, her eyes crinkling at the corners. He remembered how she had painted murals in the school hallways, her talent shining brighter than anyone else's. He remembered the day she told him she was leaving town, her excitement mixed with a hint of sadness. He had wanted to ask her to stay, but the words had stuck in his throat. And then she was gone. Now, here she was, back in his life in the most unexpected and heartbreaking way possible. David knew he had to get to the bottom of this, not just for the sake of justice, but for his own peace of mind. When the trial resumed, Emily's defense attorney called her to the stand. David watched as she walked to the witness box, her movements slow and hesitant. She looked at him briefly, her expression unreadable, before turning to face the jury. "Ms. Monroe," the defense attorney began, "can you tell the court where you were on the night of the alleged theft?" Emily took a deep breath, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I was working the night shift at Joe's Diner. I've been working there for the past 6 months. My manager can confirm my schedule." The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named Mark Sanders, wasted no time in cross-examining her. "Ms. Monroe, if you were working that night, why did the security footage show someone who looks exactly like you at the scene of the crime?" Emily hesitated, her eyes darting to David for a split second before she answered. "I don't know. All I can say is that it wasn't me." David's heart ached as he watched her struggle. He wanted to believe her, but the evidence was compelling. The jury seemed divided, their faces a mix of doubt and sympathy. As the day's proceedings came to an end, David sat in his chambers, lost in thought. He knew he was walking a fine line between personal bias and professional duty. But one thing was clear. He needed answers, not just for the court, but for himself. And then, as David prepared to leave the courthouse, a knock at his chamber door startled him. It was Emily's defense attorney, looking uncharacteristically anxious. "Your Honor," he began, his voice low, "there's something you need to know. It might change everything." David's pulse quickened. "What is it?" The attorney hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if to make sure no one was listening. "It's about Emily, and the truth behind why she's here." David leaned forward, his mind racing. What could possibly be so shocking that it needed to be discussed in secret? And how would it affect the case and his feelings for Emily? David leaned forward in his chair, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of his desk. "What truth are you talking about?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The defense attorney, a man named Jacob Hayes, hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether he should proceed. Finally, he stepped inside and shut the door behind him. "Your Honor," Jacob began, his voice low, "Emily didn't want me to bring this up. She was adamant about it, but I can't in good conscience keep it from you. The reason she's here, the reason her life took such a sharp turn, is because of someone she's been trying to protect." David frowned, his mind spinning. Protect? Who could Emily possibly be protecting? Who is she protecting? David asked, unable to keep the urgency out of his tone. Jacob's lips tightened into a thin line. Her younger brother, Max. He's not in a good place. Drugs, bad crowd, you name it. Emily's been doing everything she can to keep him afloat, but it's been at the expense of her own life. She took out loans to pay off his debts, picked up every odd job she could find. And when the money ran out well, that's when things started to spiral. David's heart sank. He remembered Max Monroe, the bright-eyed kid who used to tag along with Emily to school events. The idea of him falling into such a dark place felt surreal, but it didn't explain the theft charge. "How does this tie to the case?" David asked. Jacob hesitated again. Max owed a lot of money to some dangerous people. Emily claims she didn't commit the theft, but if she did, it was out of desperation to save him. David's chest tightened. The idea of Emily sacrificing herself for her brother wasn't hard to believe. It fit the girl he used to know. But was that enough to explain away the evidence? "She hasn't said any of this in court," David said, his voice firmer now. "Why hasn't she spoken up?" Jacob sighed. "Because Max is still out there, and she's terrified that if she drags him into this, those people he owes money to will come after him or worse." David leaned back, his mind reeling. This revelation complicated everything. If Emily was telling the truth, then she wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was protecting her brother's life. But without evidence, how could she possibly convince the jury? The next morning, David entered the courtroom with a heavy heart. He looked at Emily as she sat at the defense table, her shoulders hunched and her eyes downcast. The vibrant girl he remembered, seemed like a distant memory. As the trial resumed, the prosecution called their next witness, the manager of the tech store where the theft had occurred. He testified about the missing inventory and security protocols that had been bypassed, painting a damning picture of the crime. David watched Emily closely during the testimony. She seemed calm, almost resigned, but he could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hands gripped the edge of the table. It was clear she was holding something back. When the defense had their turn, Jacob began to poke holes in the witness's account, questioning the reliability of the security footage and pointing out inconsistencies in the timeline. But it wasn't enough to completely discredit the prosecution's case. The jury still looked uncertain, their expressions a mix of doubt and suspicion. During the lunch break, David retreated to his chambers, hoping for a moment of clarity. But instead, he found himself consumed by memories of Emily. He thought about the time she had stood up for a friend who was being bullied, how she had organized a fundraiser to help the local animal shelter, how she had always been the first to volunteer for any school project. The Emily he knew wasn't a thief. She was selfless, kind, and fiercely loyal. But people change. Life changes them. As the afternoon session began, David found himself wrestling with a question he couldn't ignore. Was it his place to intervene? As a judge, he was bound by the law. But as a man who had once cared deeply for Emily, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than what was being presented in court. The prosecution rested their case that afternoon, and Jacob called Emily to the stand. The courtroom fell silent as she made her way to the witness box, her orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the polished wood paneling. "Ms. Monroe," Jacob began, his tone gentle but firm, "can you tell the court why you've been struggling financially?" Emily hesitated, her eyes darting to David for a split second before she answered. "I've been taking care of my brother." "Ah, he's had a lot of problems. I've been trying to keep him out of trouble." Jacob nodded. "And on the night of the alleged theft, where were you?" "I was working at Joe's diner," Emily said. Her voice was steady, but David could see the effort it took for her to maintain her composure. "And do you have any reason to believe someone might have framed you for this crime?" Jacob pressed. Emily hesitated again, her hands gripping the edge of the witness box. I don't know. All I know is that I didn't do it." The prosecutor wasted no time in his cross-examination. "Ms. Monroe, isn't it true that your fingerprints were found on one of the stolen items?" Emily's face paled. "Yes, and isn't it true," the prosecutor continued, cutting her off, "that you have a history of financial difficulties, making you a likely suspect in this crime?" "I didn't do it," Emily said again, her voice louder this time, but the damage was done. The jury's expressions grew more skeptical with each passing moment. David's chest tightened as he watched her struggle. He wanted to intervene, to do something to help her, but his hands were tied. As the day's proceedings came to an end, he felt more conflicted than ever. Later that evening, as David sat in his chambers, a knock at the door startled him. This time, it wasn't Jacob, it was Emily. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice shaking. "Please." David hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was highly irregular for a judge to meet privately with a defendant, but something in her eyes made him pause. "What is it, Emily?" he asked, his voice soft. She stepped inside, her hands trembling. "There's something I haven't told anyone. And if I don't tell you now, I don't think I'll ever have the chance." David's pulse quickened. "What is it?" Emily took a deep breath, tears brimming in her eyes. "The night of the theft, I wasn't at the diner. I was at the warehouse. But it's not what you think. I was there because..." Her voice broke off as a loud knock sound, dead at the door, cutting her off mid-sentence. David's heart sank as he realized their conversation would have to wait. David's heart raced as the knock on the door interrupted Emily's confession. He looked toward her, seeing the fear in her eyes, and then to the door. "Hold that thought," he said, his voice firm but low. "We're not done." As he opened the door, the bailiff stood on the other side, his expression tense. "Your Honor, there's an urgent matter requiring your attention in the courtroom." David glanced back at Emily, who nodded slightly, as if to tell him to go. He hesitated for a moment before stepping out. Wait here. Well, finish this, he said, closing the door behind him. Back in the courtroom, the urgency became clear. The prosecutor, Mark Sanders, was standing with a smug expression, holding a folder in his hand. Your Honor, new evidence has come to light, he announced. David's stomach churned. What kind of evidence? Mark opened the folder and handed a stack of papers to the bailiff, who passed them to David. A second set of security footage from the night of the theft, Mark said. This shows Ms. Monroe leaving the scene in a car that matches hers. David's hands trembled slightly as he looked at the still images. The car in the footage was indeed identical to Emily's, but the figure driving it was wearing a hood, their face obscured. It wasn't definitive proof, but it cast more doubt on her claims. He glanced at the jury. They looked increasingly convinced by the prosecution's narrative, and David's heart sank. He had no choice but to admit the evidence. This will be entered into the record, he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. That evening, Emily sat across from David in his chambers again. She looked even more worn down than before, her usual resilience cracking under the weight of the new evidence. I didn't do it, David, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I swear. But there's something I didn't tell you earlier. Then tell me now, David urged, his tone softening. Emily took a deep breath, her hands trembling in her lap. The night of the theft, Max came to me, panicked. He said he'd gotten into trouble with some dangerous people and needed money fast. I didn't know what to do, so I went to the warehouse to meet him. He begged me not to tell anyone, said he'd fix it, but I think he might have taken my car and gone back to the store. David's heart ached at the revelation. It explained the car in the footage, but it didn't absolve Emily. Why didn't you tell this to your lawyer, or to the court? Because if I did, Mac's life would be in danger, she said, tears streaming down her face. Those people, they don't make empty threats. I thought I could take the blame, keep him safe. But now, with this new evidence, it's all falling apart. David leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He was bound by the law, but his personal feelings for Emily and his belief in her innocence clouded his judgment. He couldn't let her take the fall for something she didn't do. The next day in court, the defense called Max to the stand. It was a risky move, but Jacob had insisted it was the only way to cast reasonable doubt. Max was a wiry young man with hollow eyes and jittery movements, a stark contrast to the bright kid David remembered. He avoided Emily's gaze as he took the oath and sat down. Max, Jacob began, where were you on the night of the alleged theft? Max fidgeted, his eyes darting to the prosecutor and then to the jury. I was at home, he mumbled. Are you sure about that? Jacob pressed. Because we have reason to believe you were at the warehouse with your sister that night. Max's face paled. I don't know what you're talking about. Jacob sighed and turned to the judge. Your Honor, we request permission to introduce a text message exchange between Max and Emily from the night in question. David nodded, his throat tight. Proceed. The texts were damning. In them, Max begged Emily for help, referencing his debt and the stolen items. Emily had tried to talk him out of it, but his desperation was clear. The jury's expressions shifted. Doubt crept into their faces as they began to see Emily not as a criminal, but as a sister trying to protect her brother. In his closing arguments, Jacob painted a vivid picture of a woman caught between loyalty to her family and the harsh realities of life. Emily Monroe is not a thief, he said. She's a victim of circumstance, a woman who has sacrificed everything for her brother. She deserves your compassion, not your condemnation, the prosecutor countered, focusing on the evidence and Emily's initial dishonesty. But the jury seemed less convinced. When the verdict came, David's heart pounded in his chest. Will the defendant please rise? He said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Emily stood, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The foreperson of the jury rose and read the verdict. We find the defendant not guilty. David's gavel struck the bench, and a wave of relief washed over the courtroom. Emily's knees buckled slightly, and Jacob caught her before she fell. Tears streamed down her face as she looked up at David, gratitude shining in her eyes. After the trial, David found himself standing outside the courthouse, watching Emily as she reunited with Max. She looked over at him, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying across the distance. David nodded, a bittersweet smile on his face. "Take care of yourself, Emily." As she walked away, David felt a sense of closure, but also a pang of regret. He had done his duty, but he couldn't help wondering what might have been if life had taken a different path. And as the doors of the courthouse closed behind him, David knew one thing for certain. The past had a way of catching up with you, but it was the choices you made in the present that defined who you truly were.